everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Alan Garrow, and today we're going to be talking about his book, The Gospel of Matthew's Dependence on the Didache. The link to purchase the book is in the description, and the rest of the relevant information is also in the description as well. And that being said, welcome to History Valley, Alan Garrow.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I want to start us off with this question. What are the best examples, in your opinion, that led you to conclude that Matthew made use of the Didache and not the other way around? Because scholars typically assume that the Didache is basically familiar with the entire New Testament, but you think that Matthew actually used it.
Yes, it's a slightly complicated story, and it's worth going back to the beginning of the discovery of the Didache. So those who don't know what the Didache is, it's a book which is mentioned in a few canon lists, and then it disappears for a very long time, and it turns up in a library in Constantinople in 1873. And if you imagine yourself as somebody discovering this document and thinking, what is this? I mean, this is amazing. We can see it's probably what the fathers were mentioning, and it's been long lost for a long time. But as you read it, even in chapter 1, actually, you'd think, this has got stuff that sounds a lot like Matthew, and actually a bit like Luke too. And as you read it some more, you think, that's also like Matthew. And all the way through, 16 chapters, 16th chapter actually got a lot of connections with Matthew's gospel. Plus, there are 4 occasions when it says, essentially, do what the gospel says. And those 4 occasions match up to topics which are also mentioned in Matthew's gospel. And it looks like it's referring to a written gospel. So just putting 2 and 2 together, you'd say, this is a text which knows Matthew's gospel, and it quotes it a lot. And so that was really the starting position for scholars in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, partly because there was a kind of an assumption that the canonical gospels were the first tradition, and everything else was necessarily later than that. Things got a bit more complicated in about the middle of the 20th century, when a guy called Helmut Koester started to say, you know what, it's a bit more complicated than that, because if we look at look in detail at each place where Matthew and the Didache are a bit similar, then it doesn't actually look like the Didache is using Matthew. And what Koester proposed was that actually the references to the gospel weren't to a written gospel, they were to a gospel in a more general sense, and that Matthew and the Didache were both using a common source or sources. Since then, I'd say that is the majority position, that most scholars think that Matthew and Didache share a common environment and they're using similar sources. The thing which switched me to thinking it was a more direct thing is just observing that the Didache is a multi-author document. And that's true at 2 levels. So at one level, it looks like different people at different times have laid down different instructions. So it's a very practical document. It just tells you how to do stuff, what not to do, what to do. And that gets out of date. And so it's modified to become to fit a new situation, but the old form is still left behind. So you can see the layers, like layers of rock, being laid down, and at the same time you've got whole set pieces incorporated, especially into the base layer. So something which was written for another setting altogether is picked up and quoted in full within the Didache. So you've got a lot of different people contributing to this text. And yet, the parallels with Matthew's gospel are across the board. They're not completely uniform through the whole thing, but they're in lots of different types of text, different authors, different layers, different set pieces set within that. And they're all treating Matthew, or they're all rather similar to Matthew in each case. So what's more likely, that a bunch of people who wrote stuff that they didn't know it was going to end up in the Didache, but they go and get it from Matthew, something from Matthew, and then other people who are writing at different times with very different situations with different agendas are all going along to Matthew and putting a bit of Matthew. And what makes it even tougher is that the places where the Matthew and the Didache agree are almost always is an important word in that sentence, almost always unique to Matthew. So imagine you had a text of Matthew's gospel in a big strip, and you colored in all the bits which were similar to something you could find in Mark, and all the bits that were similar to something you could find in Luke. What you'd be left with is what we call special Matthew. And if you were to color in the bits that are like the Didache in Matthew, they would correlate with those bits of special Matthew very strongly. I wouldn't cover everything that Matthew is unique to Matthew, but there'd be a very strong connection between the Didache parallels and what you find in Matthew. So it seems to me that the simplest explanation for that set of phenomena is that Matthew, whose job really is to produce a fat version of Mark, he wants to expand Mark out, fill in information that Mark didn't provide, especially what Jesus taught about the law, what Jesus taught more generally. He knows a text called the Teaching of the Lord by the 12 apostles to the Gentiles, which is the full title of the Didache. And he thinks, well, this is good. I can use it to fill out what Mark has to say about Jesus' teaching on various subjects. And so he pulls different bits from different parts, different layers, different set pieces within the Didache to fill out his version of the teaching of Jesus. And that explains another phenomenon that's really important, which is that the Didache sometimes, but rarely, says, this is what Jesus says. Most of the time, it's just the general heading, the teaching of the Lord. It doesn't say, and Jesus said, turn the other cheek or go the extra mile or whatever it is. But every time there's something in Matthew, which is a bit like the Didache, is placed directly on the lips of Jesus. And that makes much more sense if Matthew has gone to this text, which calls itself the teaching of the Lord, used it to fill out his version of Mark, put it straight on the lips of Jesus. And so it then becomes super authoritative, which then later on creates a problem for people who know the Gospel of Matthew and the Didache and says, well, these are saying similar things, but they're slightly different. It's very slightly different Lord's Prayer, slightly different instructions about visitors and so on. So that would explain why somebody later on would say, if in doubt, do what the Gospel says. And that's why you have a final layer where Matthew's Gospel is known, but it's just directing people away from the Didache towards something which would later become a more authoritative document. That's basically the argument. A multi-layered text which has unique parallels with Matthew is much easier to explain if Matthew uses the Didache than by other means.
So basically, you're saying that the final version of the Didache is familiar with the Gospel of Matthew.
Yes,
but there was an earlier redactional layer that the Gospel of Matthew utilized.
Yes, I think actually, I mean, these kind of complications are never popular, but I think there are really good reasons for thinking there are three main stages in the development of the Didache, and Matthew knows it after those three stages. And then there's another where there's just these 4 verses which are dropped in to say, if in doubt, do what the Gospel says.
We have a question. Benjamin Love, thank you for the $10 super chat. He says, maybe I'm way out, but is it being implied that Didache is Q, Quilla?
Not yet. I'm happy to get onto that. Do you want to do that now?
Sure, by all means.
Sure. Okay, so what's the definition of Q? Now, there are various definitions you could come up with, but one is that it's a document that's used by Matthew as a source of Jesus' sayings for Matthew and for Luke. And if I'm right about Matthew using the Didache, then you're halfway there. All you need to complete the story is to say, well, is Luke using this text as well? And I think that Luke does know the Didache. I think actually he knows it at a different stage in its development than Matthew does. But the reason why that looks likely is that there's a place in chapter 1 where we've got a group of sayings which has been dropped into a thing called the 2 ways. Now, the 2 ways is very well-known basic Jewish moral teaching, and it's been expanded with a little group of sayings, which includes go the extra mile, turn the other cheek, I'll bless those who curse you, and so on. So things which we might remind us of the Sermon on the Mount. And that creates a hard join. You can see the join between where you've got something which belongs to the two ways, which includes love your neighbor as yourself and do not do to others what you would not want them to do to you. So a negative version of the golden rule. Then we go into these sayings, which are rather like Luke and Matthew. Well, the version we have of that in Luke, those two separate elements have been welded together. They've been smoothed out. We've got a bunch of positive sayings which cause the golden rule to be rendered in a positive form. That's the first time that happens. It's always negative in earlier versions of that well-known and ancient saying. So it looks like Luke has done a smoothing job on the Didache, and then Matthew, I think, knows Luke and the Didache. So he takes Luke's version, and he's drawn away from Luke's version by what he finds in the Didache. So he kind of conflates the two, which is something he does with quite a lot of different texts, or quite a lot of occasions. He conflates Mark and Luke where they're similar, Didache and Luke where they're similar, and so on. So if Matthew and Luke both know the Didache, then in that sense, the Didache is Q. But there's a really important mistake that scholars made more than 100 years ago, which has been repeated a lot of times. That happens sometimes with these things, which was they observed evidence which suggested that Matthew and Luke were using a source of Jesus' sayings. And that looks like that was right. But then they made a mistake, which was to say, if Matthew and Luke are using a source of Jesus' sayings, that means they can't also be copying one from the other. And that's not true. Just because this guy called Tatian, who produces a harmony of the Gospels in the 2nd century, sometimes he has a more original version of Mark than Luke does. Now, according to those Q scholars of all that time ago, that would mean that Tatian isn't allowed to know Luke as well as Mark. Well, that's obviously rubbish, because we know that Tatian uses Luke. So that argument, if they're using a common source, they can't use one another, just isn't true. And so then the Didache fills the place of Q, plus it shows that Matthew is actually using Luke as well, and that collapses Q to a really huge extent. So traditionally, Q has had to explain all the material that is shared by Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. How did Matthew and Luke get to agree on all this material? There's really a lot of it, quite more than 4,000 words. It's because they were both using Q. Actually, we don't need that. Q could be account for some small part of those agreements, but actually it's much simpler to say that actually Matthew is just copying Luke directly, and that's why their levels of verbatim agreement are so high. Matthew's just got Luke and he copies it out. You don't need to stuff anything in between the two of them. So to try to get to the quick of the answer, is the Didache Q? Well, you have to redefine Q pretty drastically and say, if you define Q as a source of Jesus' sayings used by Matthew and Luke, then yes, the Didache fills that function. Does it account for the whole of the material that Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark? No, because once you put the Didache in that Q position, you can see that Matthew's using Luke as well.
What would you say are some of the best examples of Matthew using Luke and combining Lucan material with Didache material?
So you need to go to chapter 1 of the Didache for that. And what you see it is in the book. What you can see is Matthew bouncing between what Luke says. So might be, bless those who curse you. And then he goes across to Matthew for another phrase, and then back to Luke for another one. Actually, turn the other cheek is a good example. So Luke has turn the other cheek and the cloak and tunic saying, if someone takes your cloak, give him your tunic also. And Matthew uses both of those, but because of the way he bounces between the two, he also includes one which comes from the Didache, which is if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go another mile also. So you can see Matthew conflating the two at that point. The two ways in the Didache, there's a way of life and a way of death. In Luke, you've got the narrow path, is it? I can't remember exactly. The narrow gate. No. He's got in Matthew, when he conflates the two, he's got a gate, a narrow gate and the broad gate. And so you've got a kind of conflation of the ways in the Didache, which have gates, and the doors in Luke. Is that right? My Bible knowledge is letting me down now. Luke has the narrow gate, is it? Jacob, how's your Bible knowledge? That's asking a lot, isn't it? I need to have better recall on that. There's a kind of combining of images in that case. Luke has be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful, and the Didache has be perfect, and Matthew combines it to make it be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. There are quite a lot of examples in the book.
Why do scholars often admit that Luke's sayings are more primitive than what's in Matthew, but despite that, they don't see it as a problem for Luke using Matthew, for their claim that Luke is using Matthew?
Well, it's different scholars which are saying those two things. So I think that so people who support the Farrer hypothesis, people like Mark Goodacre, who think that Luke is using Matthew, would say that if Luke is sometimes more primitive than Matthew, that's because Luke has access to some additional tradition or some oral tradition or something, some quirk that causes him to pick up something which is older than Matthew, but essentially he's just copying Matthew. And basically, I'm saying the same thing in reverse in a way, only just a little bit more of a concrete example. Matthew is using Luke. Sometimes he's more primitive than Luke because he's picking up something from the Didache and preserving it more faithfully than Luke does. So you get that effect of this thing called alternating primitivity, which is what caused those scholars 100 years ago to think that Matthew and Luke, you were using a shared source, which I think they are, but it doesn't mean that they can't use each other as well. But it's actually, when you get down to cases, I mean, I think probably the big and famous ones like the Lord's Prayer or the Beatitudes, the ones which kind of feel instinctively where Luke is more primitive than Matthew, then Mark Goodacre and people like him would dispute that and say, actually, isn't necessarily so. It could be that Luke is a development of Matthew. It's really hard, actually, to judge from this distance to say, oh, that's earlier than that. It's just it's a matter of scholarly judgment, and scholars are often wrong about that kind of thing.
When does the earliest layer of the Didache date in your view? And could Mark have been familiar with the earlier of an even earlier form of the Didache that Luke and Matthew are? Okay,
well, I'll take those one at a time. I think that the earliest form of the Didache, I date it to 48 CE, because I think I think in its original form, the Didache was the letter that James and the Jerusalem apostles wrote to the Gentiles in Antioch to explain what Gentiles needed to do if they wanted to become members of the Jesus movement who shared food with Jewish members of the Jesus movement. So I think you can date it quite precisely. Did Mark know it? Well, that's a tricky question, because I think that there's, in chapter 16 of the Didache, there's a description of the end times, and there's an element of that which I think Mark does know. Mark 13:7, I think it is. It seems to be adapting some ideas which are in the Didache in a more primitive form. But Mark doesn't seem to know the Didache the rest of the time. Now, I don't know whether that means, I might suggest that Mark is a lot earlier than we've previously thought. There are some people who think that Mark comes from the 40s. It may just be that Mark didn't think he was doing anything that the Didache was relevant for. So sometimes arguments from silence, it's difficult to say he didn't know it, but there's no evidence that Mark knew it. There's much more to suggest, to me at least, that Matthew knows it and Luke knows it, and quite a lot of other New Testament authors know it, but funnily not Mark.
Sorry about that. I had a little technical difficulty there for a moment.
Sure.
So do you believe at all that the hypothetical Q source could have existed or did exist? Or do you think the Didache basically substitutes for it?
I think for me, the Didache explodes the foundation of the Q hypothesis, because the Q hypothesis is built on a foundation which says Matthew did not use Luke and Luke did not use Matthew. And actually, to go into the history of scholarship again, it was just assumed that Matthew must be earlier than Luke from that early period, and so that nobody really dug that deeply into the possibility that Matthew used Luke. So when they found reasons for thinking that Luke didn't use Matthew, that was kind of enough to say Matthew doesn't use Luke, Luke doesn't use Matthew, so Q is necessary to count for all the material that Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark. But the Didache, it shows that foundation is wrong, that actually it's possible for Matthew to know Luke at the same time as using a shared source. And so there could be quite a lot of those. The Didache only accounts for a few places where Matthew and Luke share sayings of Jesus, basically at the beginning and the end of the book. But there are other places like woe to the scribes and Pharisees, where the distortion, the difference in order and wording between Matthew's version and Luke's version suggests to me that it's possible that Matthew knows the same source as Luke is using for that little discourse about scribes and Pharisees. And so Luke has been pretty free in his reworking of that, as Luke often is. And Matthew knows both versions as he tries to work them together. And so we get Matthew's version. And so that will be another example of Q in the sense of something which is a source for Luke and a source for Matthew. But we're dealing with things which, this is 2,000 years ago. We have very little data to go on. But it seems to me likely that there are lots of little bits and bobs of sources, might be oral, might be written. But the simple explanation for Matthew and Luke's similarities is really basically that Matthew is using Luke directly.
Let's take a look at a couple of slides for a moment. The four-document hypothesis, for those that don't know, that's what this diagram is, B.H. Streeter's four-document hypothesis. I know you talked about this in some of the videos that you did on your website. You got the M document on the top left, L on the top right, Q right in between. In the mid right, we got Proto-Luke. Further right, we got the document of infancy. On the far left, we got the Antiochian document. So my question about this is, why did Streeter think that all these other hypothetical documents existed, and not just the Q document, but ML, Proto-Luke, the document of infancy, and the Antiochian document?
Because he had a large imagination. I think that the current scholarship would really doesn't engage with that argument now. It's just too hard to reconstruct sources in such a hard way. That Matthew and Luke could have got their material from all sorts of different places. And so M really now just serves to as a way of talking about material which is unique to Matthew. Where he got it from, who knows? I mean, he has quite a lot of things to say about Judas. Maybe that was one source, but it's unlikely that that was the same source that he also got his unique material about the birth narrative, for example. And similarly, the L document is mostly not talked about as a single entity these days. But there is material which is unique to Luke, and so we give it the name L just because that's a convenient way of talking about it. I actually happen to be a bit of a fan of Streeter's theory about Proto-Luke, but I'm a real rarity in that regard at the moment. Most people think that Proto-Luke is a total waste of time, but I rather like the idea that Luke and Mark were writing at a similar period. And so there's an early version of Luke, which is then augmented by big chunks of Mark, which get inserted into Luke. And that would explain for me why Luke and Mark are so different about really important parts of the story. If Luke knew Mark from the start, why would he make significant changes, which just kind of raise awkward questions about why these two stories are different? But if Luke came across Mark's gospel when he'd already finished his first edition, called Proto-Luke in this diagram, and thought, this is good stuff, I want to include it, then it would explain why we have 3 or 4 big blocks of Markan material, which if you pull them out of Luke, you'd still have quite a viable narrative. It would still tell a sensible story. But when you put them in, it fills out that story a bit. It gives you a little bit more detail. And that might also explain why Luke is so super long. Matthew's gospel is the length of a standard scroll, but Luke's gospel is much longer than that. And that might be because other material was added in at a later period.
So are you saying that basically canonical Luke and canonical Mark both borrowed from Proto-Luke?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that Mark is its own thing.
Okay.
I think that I don't see a difficulty with talking about Mark as the reminiscences of Peter. I think that Proto-Luke is just, Luke's first edition, if you like, which then gets augmented by material from Mark. But that's, we're dealing with things, as I say, which happened an awful long time ago. So it's really difficult to know exactly what happened.
Well, since we talked about this a bit earlier, I'm just going to skip this slide,
Mm-hmm.
the two-document hypothesis. I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this one, the independence hypothesis. So this is a claim that not many scholars, but some scholars will make that, okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't know each other. They all got it from sources.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
I think that's not possible. As far as it's possible to be confident about anything, that seems to me to be an incredibly unlikely theory, because we have such extensive periods of similarity between all 3 of these gospels, and there's similarities of order, similarities of wording, sometimes verbatim similarities, which just make much better sense with one copying another. Oral tradition, it can be quite coherent and stable, but that stable in terms of order as well just seems a little bit far-fetched to me.
This is the Matthean Posteriority diagram, Matthew's use of Luke and Luke's use of Mark and Matthew's use of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next slide, I included a diagram of your Matthew conflator hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Why are there 3 Q's and quotations there?
Well, I might live to regret, maybe I already do, using the term Q at all, because it has a particular meaning for so many people and so many scholars. But what I was trying to say was there might be lots of different sources which are used by Matthew and Luke. And if the definition of Q, which I put in quotes, is a source of Jesus sayings used by Matthew and Luke, then that's how I represent that. I actually put myself in the camp of the Matthean Posteriority Hypothesis. So my friend and colleague, Rob McEwen, who you've had on the show before, we're really on the same team. I think that a part of the story is that the Didache is in the mix, but actually a much more important question to ask first of all is, what's the relationship between Matthew and Luke? Because if Matthew uses Luke, then we're then left with those white bits on the diagram, which are not colored in because we can see Matthew getting it from Mark, we're getting it from Luke. And that then draws you into thinking, makes it much clearer, I think, that Matthew is also using the Didache and other stuff as well. But it's good to take one question at a time. When I produced the article which this diagram was in, then I have a project which is currently ongoing, drawing towards a close, I hope soon, which is about the Didache, saying, what is the Didache? And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's the In its first form, it was the letter that James and the apostles wrote to the Gentiles in Antioch. That's a pretty big claim. And so there are a lot of steps to be made to defend that thesis. But if we're just talking about and Matthew using Luke and the gaps which are left corresponding to the Didache are part of that story. But if we're just focusing on the synoptic problem and not worrying about the Didache for a minute, it's much more important to say, oh, do we think that Mark is first? Yeah, that seems really likely. And actually, not everybody, but 99.9% of scholars active in this field at the moment think that Mark was used by both Matthew and Luke. So the next question is, what's the relationship between Matthew and Luke? There are really only two possibilities to look at to start off with. Either Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew. If you could be really sure that neither of those was true, there's some really good reason why Matthew couldn't have used Luke and Luke couldn't have used Matthew, then you're into the territory of the two document or the four document hypothesis that you showed earlier. But that question hasn't been bottomed out yet. There's been a lot of work done on whether or not Luke used Matthew, but it's really only since Rob McEwen's book in 2015, that's like a nanosecond in the history of the study of this discipline ago, such a short time ago, people have started to ask serious questions about whether Matthew used Luke. That's not to say people haven't proposed that in the past. Plenty of people have, but it's never got into the mainstream of discussion. So this diagram, thanks for putting it up. I still believe it's true. I think the Didache is one of those Qs, and there might be other documents out there or lost long ago which qualify as Q because they were used by Matthew and Luke. But I don't think they're anything like or only barely similar to what we commonly think of as Q with a big capital, the critical edition of Q, or the people who support the two document hypothesis, how they see Q, a big substantial document of about 4,500 words. It's really not that. It's odds and ends of maybe 450 words or 200 words or 100 words.
We have another super chat question. Paul Kickling, thank you for the 10 pounds. Do you think there might, I think you meant the type, do you think there might be undiscovered manuscripts existing more eastward from apostles going to proselytize, perhaps even Jewish, from post-Babylonian slavery, since we know some Jews traveled to India? I
truly don't know. I think all things are possible, and we're constantly being surprised by manuscript discoveries. Really, the 20th century and the Victorian period were when scholars went out, consciously looking for stuff and searching through libraries, and a lot of stuff was turned up then, including the Didache for that matter. But is it possible? It's possible. Is it likely? I don't think so necessarily, but it's not something I know that much about. Sorry for not giving you a better answer.
Do you think that Mark's gospel made use of an earlier redactional form of the Didache?
No.
Okay. What about Proto-Luke?
Yes. Because I think that Luke knows the apostolic decree, which is what I think the Didache is. I think he uses it in Acts, and I think he uses it in Luke.
There are some scholars today that believe that Luke Acts. Well, first off, do you think that Luke actually wrote Acts? I know that there are some scholars that take the position that it's not the same author.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that Luke and Acts are written by the same person, and that is the mainstream view. Doesn't mean to say that it's right, but that's what most scholars agree.
All right, in that case, do you think that Luke Acts made use of Josephus? Because there are some scholars that think that Luke and Acts knew Josephus.
There are, and they're good scholars, and I think there are good arguments for it, but I don't think that he does. It's the same kind of argument about, who depends on whom, but the amount of evidence available is microscopic compared to what we have in exploring the relationship between Matthew and Luke, for example, and it's taken a long time to pin that one down. So my view at the moment is that Luke doesn't know Josephus, but I respect those who think that he does.
What do you make of the reverse of that claim? Because there's some others that will say, actually, Josephus used Luke.
Well, I'd be very interested to read that material and evaluate it. I've not seen that myself. I'm conscious of a couple of books which have come out recently which argue for Luke not using Josephus, but I don't know the other way around.
To return to that diagram for a moment. So you think that you were saying earlier about you think that a Didache is one of those Qs, but basically you're also pointing out that none of those free Qs are the same as the hypothetical Q document. It's a very different situation from the Q document.
Sure.
What do you think of the modified two document hypothesis, which is okay, fine, Luke knew Matthew, or I guess Matthew used Luke, depending on which scholar looks at it, and they'll say, but we still need Q, the hypothetical Q document exactly as defined, and so on.
I think that is not true. I think a modified Q there could be scope for, but I would want to modify it a lot, because if you just look at how similar the preaching of John the Baptist, for example, is in Matthew and Luke, to try and interpose another source between those two, it just seems completely unnecessary. We're all have to remember we're always dealing in probabilities. We can't prove anything. We can just say this possibility is more likely than another one. And it seems to me that the simplest way to explain passages like that, which are totally similar for a whole block, is that one is directly copying the other. I think there are really good reasons why Luke isn't copying Matthew. And so it's simple to say that Matthew is copying Luke. Let's not make, I mean, I think there's a good policy not to make more Qs than we actually strictly need, while recognizing that they're likely to be out there at some level. Because, we're in a situation where all sorts of people are going to be saying a lot of different things about Jesus, and what they said might have eventually have made their way into the written Gospels that we have. But tracing that journey, it's probably not possible in most cases. We're just incredibly fortunate to have the Didache to supply one example of how that journey might have been made, I think, at least.
In the book, you also talk about parallels between the book of Revelation and the Didache.
Mm-hmm.
But you also pointed out that the Didache hasn't finished the story. I think it was about, if I remember correctly, I think it was about the Antichrist persecution of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Revelation, the Revelation story is more furnished by its theological portrayal of the hope of those being persecuted, something like that.
Yeah.
So you're saying that Revelation also used the Didache?
Yes, very much so. I think that the story is a little bit more complicated in that case, but Didache 10 provides instructions for how to pray a Eucharistic prayer. And it's a prayer which has got a lot of Johannine language in it, talking about eternal life. And it finishes with the instruction, allow the prophets to give thanks as much as they wish. Now, if you go to the end, the last chapter of the Didache, it talks about what's going to happen in the end times. It's a very short few verses, just think about 7 verses altogether. And the story that it tells is that there's going to be persecution, and then the world deceiver or the Antichrist comes, and that produces a big persecution. And those who survive or don't not survive it, but they stay in their faith. They don't renounce their faith, even to the point of death in that persecution. They get to be caught up to join the Lord at his coming. That's kind of implied. And then there's a final resurrection for judgment, and the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. And then there's a reward for that's beyond imagining for the good people. That last verse of the Didache, actually, from the one manuscript we have, which was found in Constantinople, that the last few lines are missing. I've reconstructed them using work by a guy called Robert Aldridge and also some paraphrases of the Didache which survive in other places, to include that kind of that final reward scene, that final judgment scene. The simple story that's told in the Didache maps onto the story told by Revelation, but in Revelation it's expanded massively. So I think what's happened in Revelation is that the prophet is giving thanks as much as he wishes and using the template of the Eucharistic prayer provided in Didache 10, expanding it to tell the story which is told in Didache 16. So you get 6 separate installments in Revelation, each of which finishes with a cliffhanging ending. So you come back next week to find out what happens. And also at each ending, there's a kind of invitation to the Eucharist. So blessed is he who is invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then we get to share in the bread and wine, which is the foretaste of the heavenly banquet, which we can ultimately look forward to. We come back next week, have a little bit more of the story, the cliffhanging ending, participate in the Eucharist, and so on. So I think that Revelation is far downstream from the Didache. It's taking little seed ideas in the Didache and growing them into big plants. Or it's I would say that the Didache is like the creative fountainhead. It gives you the raw materials which are then exploded into the majestic wonders of Johannine theology and apocalyptic ideas and storytelling.
When do you date all the 4 Gospels?
With caution. So I'm pretty confident. We're going to start with the more confident and go down from now. I'm pretty confident that Matthew is post 80. That's not especially controversial, but I think there are really good reasons for thinking that he's after 80, because I think there's just a chance he knows Revelation. It's a very small bit of evidence, but it appeals to me. Mark, I am not confident about. I think that you'll know that most scholars put it around 70. I think it could be anywhere between 40 and 70. One of the things that's difficult with dating any text in the New Testament is that if you date it on the strength of one verse or even a couple of verses, then we kind of assume that the Gospels landed complete and unaltered forever afterwards, and that isn't necessarily the case. So that's sometimes that makes dating them really difficult. But pre-70, I'd say for Mark. Then Luke, I put in the 50s, 60s. Again, that I might be generating howls of protest from any scholars watching this who think that Luke is much later than that. Some people put it into the 2nd century. But that's where I'm leaning at the moment. I'm working on a book which will help to defend that argument. And then John's Gospel is a funny one. I think that it's particularly difficult to date because it's a bit like a building that's been made out of other buildings. So imagine you had a kind of an old church in your town and it was falling down. So people decide, well, we'll rescue the building blocks in this and use it, incorporate them into a more modern building. That's a little bit what John's Gospel looks like to me. So it could be that there's some really old material in there, which has been worked together by later authors or editors to create the Gospel that we have now. So you could have a time span for starting at 40s all the way to 100. It seems to me it's not so great to date a text. Didache be a classic example of this on what the latest bit of it. If you've got earlier bits, it's worth noticing them as well.
Could you provide a couple of examples that persuaded you that Matthew more likely knew the book of Revelation?
It's just a little thing, but if you were to color in all of Matthew's apocalyptic discourse, Matthew 24, 25, if you color in all the bits that could come from Luke and all the bits that could come from the Didache, then there's just a little fraction which looks like Revelation 1:8 about the Lord coming on the clouds. That's all. It doesn't amount to a great deal, but it strikes me as interesting.
We do have a super chat question. Johnny Spinoza, thank you for the $4.99. Revelations is anti-Roman. Does that give it legitimacy, or not so much. Now, in another text he wrote after that, he corrected it. He said that Revelations, he meant to say that Revelations is pro-Roman, not anti-Roman. So what do you think of his question?
I think that Revelation is definitely anti-Roman, because but actually I should pull back on that. I don't think it is completely anti-Roman. Personally, I think that Revelation identifies Nero as the Antichrist in a very specific way, because in chapter 17, he talks about the beast that was, is not, and is to come. So at the time of writing, the beast is not. One of the heads is reigning, so yeah, the Roman Empire is still in power, but he doesn't see it as the actual, specific Antichrist, which is trying to draw worship to itself. So I think that Nero is 666, and I think he's the one, the first head who was killed, and people thought he was going to come back again. And so John makes these strong parallels between Nero on the negative side and Jesus on the positive side. Does it make it legitimate? I'm not quite sure the category of the question, really. I think that what we have in the New Testament is people trying to interpret their faith in the situations that they found themselves in. And sometimes they're in a situation where the government is a positive or a neutral thing. And sometimes they're in a situation where the government is killing Christians for being Christians, at which point it's hard to be positive about it. And so it makes sense that they should challenge that political system. And I think it's really important that voice is part of the New Testament. When you listen to Christians in South Africa during apartheid, Revelation was a really important text for them, as it is for Christians in lots of situations under persecution, trying to see, how is God calling us to respond to the situation where the people in power are killing us because of what we believe?
What do you make of those parallels between Nero and the way that Revelation portrays Jesus? And when Nero died, you had 3 different people that we know of that were trying to claim, oh, I'm Nero, I'm the returned Nero. And you got some people writing prophecies that Nero is going to destroy Rome with the Persian army. And so on top of these, the second coming of Nero prophecy, the Nero impersonators, kind of like what we see in the New Testament. I think even in Matthew's gospel, Matthew talks about that there will be imposters or false Christs, kind of like what Revelation does, if I remember correctly. Revelation talks about that, the false Christs. Don't believe them even if they do miracles. It's not what it looks like. So are these New Testament texts transposing, I guess, what I could call Neronian characteristics to Jesus? Is that what's going on here?
I think that's really happening there's a counterpoint, compare and contrast in Revelation for sure. I'm not sure that's happening in Matthew specifically. I would trace all that Antichrist imagery and the idea of an Antichrist back to the Didache. That's the seed end times description, which then finds expression in lots of different Christian texts later on down the line. Revelation interprets that through the lens of the particular situation that John found himself in Asia Minor, where Nero seemed like a really good example of the sort of person that people were following and thinking he was going to provide the answers, bring salvation. And John was saying, no, you really don't want to get into that line of worship. You need to be exclusive in your allegiance to Jesus.
Do you think that Paul knew about the Didache?
I do. It's one of the things which is interesting about the Didache, that there's so little, there's no Pauline references in it at all. And that's kind of weird if it's a later text, because Paul has such a big influence elsewhere. But I think that Paul does know the Didache, because I think that the Didache is the apostolic decree that James and the apostles wrote in 48 CE. And I think that Paul was present at that occasion. I think he took that decree and presented it to the Gentile Christians in Antioch and also in Galatia and in Thessalonica and in Corinth and so on. He became disenchanted with it, I'd say, because the problem with this text, in the Acts 15 version of the Apostolic Decree, where it says, we decided that it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no further burden than to avoid fornication, meat that's been strangled, blood, and food sacrificed to idols. That's just a little software patch which Luke adds, so that when you look through what he says about it to the text in the background, you're not troubled by the instructions that it gives you. But the original Didache is a little bit ambiguous. So on the one hand, you can read it as saying, if you're baptized according to the two ways to live, which is, don't do this, don't do that, then you can participate in the Eucharist. You're home free. You're a member of this community. But you could also read it as saying, that's a temporary measure. We recognize the facts on the ground. These Gentiles are eating and worshipping with Jewish Christians, and we want to kind of reduce the problem with that as much as we can. Say, well, just don't eat food sacrificed to idols, and keep these basic rules so there's peace in the meantime. But at the end of the text in chapter 16, it says, the whole time of your faith will be of no account unless you are perfected at the final hour. And a way of reading that is that the perfection which is required is full Torah observance. So it's kind of saying, second-class Gentile Christians, we understand you're inferior, but we'll let you carry on being inferior for the time being. But in the end, you need to be full Torah observant Jews like us, which includes circumcision. And so it becomes a bit of a double-edged sword. When Paul presents it to the Gentiles in Galatia, he says, look, this is great. This is what the apostles have said. You don't need to be circumcised to be baptized. And if you're baptized, you can share in the common meal. You're done. But then his opponents come behind him and say, well, everything that Paul taught you is absolutely true. That's great. We're really glad that you've got baptized. But there is another step to be taken. And Paul, if he was here, he endorsed this document and he went to the apostles to ask for it in the first place. He would tell you that you need to take the next step and get circumcised. So they write to him and say, this is me conjecturing here, of course. They write to him and say, Paul, you'll be so pleased with us. Your friends from Jerusalem have come and they've explained that what's the next thing we need to do to make progress in our faith towards being saved. So we're all ready to get circumcised. And that's why he writes Galatians with such passion and desperation and anger and exasperation. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? How has somebody tricked you into thinking that this other gospel, even if we or an angel from heaven should teach you another gospel, don't listen to it. And there's a very interesting verse in that book, which is Galatians 5:11, where he says, why am I still being persecuted if I still preach circumcision? It's really mysterious how anybody at any time could have presented Paul as preaching circumcision, because the thing we know about Paul is he doesn't teach circumcision for Gentiles. So scholars are really puzzled over that verse, but a possible explanation is that he endorsed this document, which, when read in a certain way, says you do need to be circumcised in the end. And his opponents have come and said to these Galatians, Paul, this is what Paul would have told you if he stuck around a little longer. And so they think, by getting circumcised, that's what Paul would have wanted, because he did give us this document and told us that it was a good and worthwhile thing that we should be observing. I think the Didache in its original form sits really large behind Paul's letters, the early ones. So why did the Thessalonians grieve without hope over those who had died? Because of the way they'd read the end times description in Didache 16, and they got confused by that. The way Paul responds to that makes perfect sense if he's taking that tradition and reworking it so that their problems, their fears are allayed. Yeah, it's a really big feature of Paul's early life. Once he's had that Galatian crisis, he's become seriously disenchanted with it, and it falls out of his letters pretty much altogether. You do get a bit of a reference to it in Romans, but in those early days, 1-2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, and Galatians, it's really front and center. I would say it fills completely the background to Galatians, actually.
A couple of super
That's a
chat.
big claim. That's a big claim, and as I say, I'm working on the defense of that, which will be out in a couple of years.
We got a couple of super chat questions. Paul Kickling, thank you for £10. Revelations was using happenings on Earth, Nero, to parallel what will happen in higher realms if you combine it with the backdrop of Hermetic Platonic mysticism that light reflects each other. Thoughts?
I'm sorry, Paul. I'm unable to answer that question because I don't know enough about Hermetic Platonic mysticism and about light reflecting each other. Really sorry.
So this one, Elias Al-Moody, thank you for the $5. Some scholars believe the Didache portion about false apostles asking for money is in relation to Paul, 1 Corinthians 9. What do you think?
That's a great question. Thanks, Elias. I don't think it is about that. I think that the false apostles section in the Didache is very strange, and it takes a little. There's a couple of layers which have been set together there, and they need prizing apart. But when you get back to the oldest instructions in the Didache, they're really odd because they say, "Let every apostle be received as the Lord." So there's no test. We know they're an apostle already as they're walking up the drive, and we don't then kind of say, "Can you show us your credentials or give us your letters, or can you show us by your behavior that you're an apostle?" There's nothing of that. And then what happens is if they stay for more than 2 days, they're a false prophet, and if they ask for money, they're a false prophet. That's a really weird metric, isn't it, for discerning whether someone's a false prophet or not? So I think that actually that's talking about a very specific situation which predated the Apostolic Council. And there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll stop it there. Just to answer your question, I don't think that that's a reference to Paul. I think it's a reference to people who came from Jerusalem to Antioch.
Final question. Why was the Didache modified so much?
Because it's like a car manual, and the car changes. Because it's a really practical document which says, do that, do this in a particular situation with particular resources to a particular audience. That audience and that situation changes over time. And I think actually that the thing about the Apostolic Decree, if that's what the original Didache was, is it was addressing an incredibly specific situation, but it did so with massive authority. So it was that the 12 apostles were saying, these are the rules about baptism, communion, visitors, apostles, and the end times. And so even though it addressed a very narrow situation, what was happening in Antioch, it came to be used in a much wider set of circumstances because of that authority. But those wider circumstances didn't fit. They didn't. The rules didn't address that situation. So having rules where if somebody stays for 2 days, they're a false prophet. That's just kind of mad. So you then need to write a different version of those rules to accommodate a more general situation. And actually, the next version of those rules in particular are much more sane, much more rational. They say if someone has a means of supporting themselves, then they can settle with you. If someone asks for money, but it's for somebody else, then someone who has need, then that's okay. They're not false for that reason. You should help them as much as you can on their onward journey, but they shouldn't sponge off you. It's just kind of basic common sense, really, in the way that the earlier versions of those rules really aren't. If you tried to live by them, you'd be in a pickle pretty shortly.
Well, thank you for joining me today, and I thank everybody for everyone that super chatted their questions. It helps me continue this channel and the work that I'm doing here. And I thank everyone else for their live chat participation. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me again, Professor Garrow.
You're welcome. See you, everybody.
Yep, bye-bye. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.